Gotcha. You want to start again from the top?
I think you should just go, Tom.
Good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon. MarsCon 2021, the forces of darkness. The forces of darkness are out and they are about. They stopped us from talking to you. We started talking to you a few minutes ago and they didn't want you to hear what we had to say, but we've overcome those forces of darkness. We are back live and hopefully you can hear me now. Everybody wave at the camera if you can hear me. Hope you're all waving at the cameras. But I can't see you, so it really doesn't make that much difference. But good afternoon, my name is Tom. I'm the Minnesota Mufon State Director, and I hope you enjoyed that video of the presentation that Minnesota Mufon did for Warren, Minnesota, a number of years back, and also some of the other more interesting cases that MUFON has had over the past few years. So I am joined by my Assistant State Director, Mike Harris, and our Chief Investigator, Bill McNeff. We may have another one of our field investigators stopping in shortly, and I know that Bill's got some stuff he wants to tell you about. If need be, I've got another UFO story from Long Prairie, Minnesota. I can share with you a PowerPoint slide if you're interested in that, and if we have time for that. Someone is saying confirm sound is working this time. Very cool. I got a confirmation that our sound is working, so that is great. So I'm going to pitch it to my Assistant State Director, Mike Harris, and then we'll pitch it to Bill McNeff, and Bill McNeff has some stuff he wants to share with you. But right now, I'll turn it over to the Assistant State Director, Mike Harris. Take it away, Mike.
Thanks, Tom. So I've spoken at MarsCon the past few years. We can't this year, unfortunately, for obvious reasons. But last year I did 3 different talks. I talked about traits and characteristics of abductees. A lot of people have a lot of symptoms of that, which I can go into later if you want. I also talked about some well-known cases. I talked about an incident in Brazil where some Skrill girls saw a craft that had crashed and some aliens that came out of it several years ago. There were numerous witnesses, including some firemen and a farmer and his wife saw it. Unfortunately, one of the firemen that touched one of the creatures supposedly died from it shortly thereafter. And I also talked about the Betty and Barney Hill case. They were a couple in the early 60s, one of the very first really big, well-known cases of abduction. They had missing time and underwent hypnosis together through a psychiatrist and recalled the same story together. So if you want, I can talk about that a little bit today. We're going to answer questions about Warren, and pretty much after there'll be Q&A. So, and I think up next we have Bill McNeff, correct?
That's correct. Okay, I'm a former state director from MUFON, former assistant state director. Presently, I'm chief investigator for Minnesota MUFON. And since Mike Harris talked about the Val Johnson case, I could tell you about a very similar case, which happened 2 months after the Val Johnson case. So I'll go ahead unless you have some questions for one of the other 2 panelists. I don't see anything showing up on the screen yet, so here goes.
And Bill, can you get a little closer to your microphone? You're kind of hard to hear, so.
Okay, this case is happened 2 months after Val Johnson's experience up in the same area. This is case 4038, which happened October 29th, 1979. And this is a report from a military police sergeant who was in the process of moving from Alaska to the contiguous United States. Here is his statement. This is a statement on the events that took place at approximately 2200 hours on October 29th, 1979. At the time of this incident, I was 25 years old and was a sergeant, E5, military police officer, on active duty in the U.S. Army. I had departed Fort Wainwright, Alaska a few days earlier and was driving to my next duty station, which was Fort Snelling, Minnesota, in working in AWOL apprehension. We had turned off Highway 29 in North Dakota and were headed east on Highway 1 in Marshall County, Minnesota. I was driving a 1977 Chevrolet. My wife, Susan, was in the car with me, and we were just past the town of Alvarado when we observed an extremely bright light on the road approximately 1 mile ahead. After about a minute or so, we determined that whatever it was moving because we were not closing on it. Now, being the cocky young military policeman that I was, I decided I was going to find out what this light was. I accelerated to a high speed. I'm guessing close to 100 miles an hour. As I started closing on the light, I observed that the light was an extremely bright yellowish light, which appeared to be approximately 4 to 6 feet in diameter. It was above the center lines in the road, and it was about 3 to 4 feet above the road surface. As I got to approximately 100 yards of the light, traveling at about 100 miles an hour, it suddenly came off the center lines into the middle of my lane and was coming right at me. I immediately locked up the brakes and swerved onto the shoulder of the roadway. Everything in the car was flying into the front seat. Instantly, the light was back to approximately 1 mile ahead of us again. Now I was ticked off. I took off after it again, determined to see what the light was. Again, as I got to within approximately 100 yards of the light, traveling at about 100 miles an hour, it suddenly came off the center lines into the middle of my lane again and was coming right at me. I immediately locked up the brakes and swerved onto the shoulder of the roadway. And instantly, the light was back to approximately 1 mile ahead of us again. This time, I was able to observe that the bottom portion of the light merged into a brighter white light than the rest of it. It was so bright that we had to squint our eyes even when we were closing on it. Now I was really ticked off. So off I went after it for the third time with about the same results. However, this time I estimated that we came within 30 to 50 feet of the object. We almost hit it. At that point, we decided not to try that anymore. We followed it at a safe distance for a couple more minutes. I turned my lights off and on and flashed my brights a few times, but it just kept heading down the road. Then it just disappeared. I thought maybe it had gone out of sight down a hill, but there was no hill. About 1 mile later, we entered the town of Warren, Minnesota. As we continued past the town, we observed a bright light in our rearview mirror. We watched it for about a minute, then it disappeared. I don't know if it was what we chased or if it was just a car that was behind us. We talked about what had just happened, trying to figure out what the heck that object was. I don't think a UFO was high on our list because one would think of UFOs as flying away, not playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse in northwest Minnesota. What really ticks me off is that I had a good 35 millimeter camera in the car, but didn't think about it at all during this incident. My sister immediately said, "It wasn't in Warren, was it?" At that point, I got a knot in my stomach and the hair on the back of my neck rose with that goosebump chill thing. I said, "What do you mean it wasn't in Warren?" Since we had just driven about 3,000 miles and she nails this sighting to within a few miles. She said, "Tell me what you saw." So I told her what we had seen, and she stated that a Marshall County deputy sheriff was hit by the UFO about 2 months ago. Now I was heading for my new military police unit at Fort Sheridan, Illinois, with duty at Fort Snelling, and I didn't want to get labeled as a loony, So I only told my friends and relatives about the UFO that I chased. A few months later, I heard the deputy sheriff, Val Johnson, being interviewed on a radio talk show, and I made up my mind that I would call him and talk with him. I called up to Marshall County, and they said he worked at the Oslo Police Department. I called the Oslo Police Department and stated why I was calling. They called Val Johnson at home, and he okayed them to give me his home phone number. I then called Val and stated that I believed that I had chased the object that had hit him. I described to him what had happened. He stated that of all the people that had reported UFO sightings up there, he was sure that I had chased the object that had hit him. He stated that as I was describing the incident, he was remembering the small details about the light, such about it being above the center line and it having a brighter white lower portion that he had never reported in his statements. I often thought about what it was and why it would be playing cat and mouse with a car in northern Minnesota. The only theory I can come up with is as follows. If it was that some kind of extraterrestrial or extra dimensional beings were observing our civilization, they would surely be interested in what could hurt them. The Grand Forks Air Force Base and ICBM missile silos are not too far from there. Could it be possible that the object was monitoring the military base from that area? It being about 3 to 4 feet above the road surface would give it a vertical obstacle clearance and keep it below the radar screens. It being above the center line in the road would give it left and right side obstacle clearance. Vehicles like the sheriff's squad car and my car were probably minor inconveniences to its mission, requiring throwing a scare into the occupants if they got too close. That's the end of the sergeant's statement. But based on all that I've learned over the years, I think that the sergeant's theory could be right on the mark. So, does anybody have any questions that they'd like to address to any of the three of us?
So there is a request coming in for the Long Prairie Island or Long Prairie, Minnesota tin can aliens case, which I can do, but more kind of to what you're talking about, Bill. We did get a request come in. They're asking, is the presence of personal and or military drones increasing the reports of UFOs? In other words, does it seem people are confusing UFOs with drones? And I'll take a little stab at that. There is some confusion, and of course, if it's unidentified and we don't know it's a drone, it's hard to say. But some of that is showing up. But Bill, you're chief investigator. What's your thought on military and personal drones showing up in UFO reports?
Well, it's going to be very difficult to tell military drones from UFOs, probably in many cases. And then there's always the possibility of secret military aircraft. So we are getting more and more cases that I think the answer could be secret military aircraft, secret US military aircraft. So.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's really hard to tell because we don't know what it is. And a lot of times, when it comes to the military, we don't know what we don't know, so it's really hard to say. But it opens up another possibility when we try to. A lot of times with UFO cases and reports, we're trying to eliminate what it could be, and it just adds another category of something that it could be, which adds a little more to the investigation and adds a little more that we need to look at. So, Mike, do you have anything you want to contribute on that question about drones and the UFO reports?
I've heard in general, aside from Mufon, the answer is yes, it has increased it. But we haven't had a lot of our ones ourselves, have we, where people have, seen it and we thought it was a drone? Because like you said, it's hard to tell after the fact.
That's right. Not a lot of cases.
And that question came from Pat. So thank you, Pat, for your question. We certainly appreciate that.
Well, I could go ahead with another case.
If you want to, sure, because we can do Long Prairie, Minnesota. We've got time, so I can hold off on the tin can aliens if you want to do another one, Bill.
Okay. This is quite a case. This is a case that has quite a number of witnesses and some material evidence. This occurred in Willerny, Minnesota on February 11th, 1982. And for those of you that aren't aware of it, Willarney, Minnesota is bordered on all sides by the city of Matamidi. And the population in 2010 was 507 people. So back in February 11th, 1982, sometime after midnight, a teenage girl in Willarney became aware of a bright green light filling her second floor bedroom. She looked out the window and saw a bright green light with an oval shape hovering at street light height. Actually, she said probably about 3 telephone poles high off the ground. This UFO shot down several streams of orange fireballs into the street and snowbanks right before her eyes. There were about 2 feet of snow on the ground. Then the UFO simply vanished. In the morning, her uncle was called, who called his best friend, and they rushed to the site before anyone else could arrive. The 2 men found a dozen cylindrical holes in the snow in front of the house at an intersection at the end of the driveway. At the bottom of each hole was a fragile cylindrical ash-like blackened shape. These ash cylinders were hollow. The best friend of the uncle broke off a piece of one ash cylinder and placed it promptly in a small jar with a piece of tissue to protect it and placed the lid on the jar to seal it. That is what he told us. This witness saved this jar with a sample for years, trying to find someone to analyze it. But he came up to me after the Warren, Minnesota presentation, which we gave in August of 2019, and gave the sample to me to be analyzed. Judging from the curved fragment, which I could see through the glass wall of the jar, and the witness's description, the ash cylinders were roughly the shape of a test tube. 2 articles on the sighting appeared in the Willarney paper. Other people in Willarney saw the UFO that night, including the mayor. And I should mention that the girl's mother and her father and one of her brothers all saw this object, at least got a glimpse of the green light that same night at the time that she saw it. So we gave the sample to a chemist who is a member of Mufon to be analyzed. And that is where that case stands right now. So we have material evidence. We have quite a number of witnesses, including the mayor of Willarney. So that is the Willarney case. I'll turn it over to Tom or Mike again.
Yeah, and it's an interesting case. I want to throw this out because there is a request for another story, and I don't know the story. Maybe Bill or Mike knows it, but the request is tell the story of the 6 ghost hunters in the cemetery. UFOs appeared overhead, and their ghost hunting tools and cameras were turned upward to film 3 UFOs that crossed over them 5 minutes apart. Do either one of you two know that story? Because I personally don't know and can't tell that story.
No,
I don't have it. If I can bring up my Word document that has it. Well, I can summarize it. You've given a pretty good summary so far, but yes, these ghost hunters, headed by Dr. Adrian Lee, who heads up a paranormal group here in Minnesota, and his ghost hunting team were in this cemetery, and they had video cameras set up. They had detectors of various kinds, and one of their detectors gave something that sounded very suspicious, and they saw this yellow round object in the distance, and they turned the video camera on it and recorded it. And this object approached them. It probably might have gotten as appeared as large as the full moon at its closest, and it flew overhead and flew out of sight. And then a few minutes later, a second object, the same description, did the same thing when they videoed that also. And then about the same lapse of time later, a third object came overhead, came and flew the same course as the other two, which they videoed also. So we had some very good video evidence and several witnesses to it. And I guess that's a pretty good summary of the case. I consider it one of the better cases.
Cool. Mike, do you have anything you want to add, or should I go into Long Prairie, Minnesota, and the Tin Can Aliens?
I was just going to say in general, we do meet the second Saturday of each month for people that may not be aware of that are listening right now. And we met yesterday, but we will meet next month. And we will discuss the case that I'll just discuss a bit more in the future. But my email address is mufonmichael@comcast.net. That's MUFONMICHAEL@comcast.net. If anybody has any questions or wants to listen to our meetings or come to our meetings when we just start having them again in person, that's the way to reach one of us.
Yeah, and our online meetings are and all of our meetings are on the second Saturday of each month. Starting, the formal part of the meeting starts about 2:00. We start checking people in at about 1:30 p.m.
Yep, and you can find out that information. You can contact the guys at MarsCon. They know us. You can reach out to them. Our website is mnmufon or www.mnmufon.org. But yeah, reach out second Saturday of every month. We'd be happy to have you join us. So if Bill and Mike have nothing else, I can move to Long Prairie unless you guys have some more comments you want to add in.
I'm good right now.
The Long Prairie.
Long Prairie. Okay. So, the thing is, I really like the Long Prairie case. It's a very interesting case. And the thing about when you're researching cases and investigating cases, because there's the whole argument, do UFOs exist? Do they not exist? Do aliens exist? Do they not exist? Are they visiting us? And any case, you could argue, supports their existence and also does not support their existence. And what I mean by that is, if you take a lot of the cases where everybody's really familiar with the short gray alien type, you could argue that, oh, well, that person is just making it up because they just heard what everybody else said. Now they're just adding it up and they're making up their own story. So it kind of would take away from the probability of it being real. Or you could flip that around and say, because everybody is seeing the same thing, that adds credibility and credence to it is an actual phenomenon that actually is happening, to have all these people seeing the same things. And that's a typical case. Now, there's also the atypical cases, which you could make the same argument. You could take an atypical case and go, well, it's so different from what everybody else is reporting, it must be fake, because if it was real, it'd be like everybody else's. Or you could say, because it's so different, why would they make up something that was different? They would want to make, if they're going to make it up, they'd make up something believable, which would be like the other ones. So to make up something unique wouldn't make sense. That lends to its credibility. And the Long Prairie, Minnesota case, that is one of those atypical cases where it's very unique, and the entities seen there are very unique. And I know Natasha said she wanted me to let her know when I want to switch over to screen sharing. So Natasha, I'm ready to switch over to screen sharing. I don't know how you want to indicate to me when it's ready for me to screen share, but I'm ready to do that at any time right now. Oh, Natasha says good. So I'm going to go to screen sharing. Where do I have it? Looks like I got it right here. So let's do that and we'll share. So this case took place in Long Prairie, Minnesota, and it's kind of affectionately known as the Tin Can Alien case. This took place on October 23rd of 1965 at approximately 7:15 p.m. And it's interesting too, because MUFON was actually started right on I think it was May 30th of 1969. So this case actually predates MUFON, and it's not even in our database. This case actually can be found in the NUFORC database, and NUFORC stands for the National UFO Reporting Center. So this is a case that went to NUFORC and isn't actually in our MUFON database, but it is a really cool case in my estimate. It's one of my favorites. I really like it. So Long Prairie, Minnesota. Is this going to advance for me? Let's see if it'll get it to advance. So Long Prairie is approximately a 2-hour drive northwest of Minneapolis, right here, kind of just right in central Minnesota. So that's where Long Prairie is. And now it's still not going to advance for me. Come on. There we go. And this case was submitted by James or Jerry Townsend. At the time, he was a 19-year-old radio disc jockey for KEYL in Long Prairie, Minnesota. So you can see on the right, there's the highway coming in the Long Prairie. There's right where KEYL KXDL is still today. So right off the highway there. And that highway is key to the case because he was actually on that highway when he had the sighting. Oh, it looks like Dean DeHartport is joining us. So Dean is another one of our field investigators. Once I finish up with the Long Prairie, Minnesota case, we're always open for questions. We'll certainly take the questions, but we'll also introduce Dean when I finished up here. We'll give Dean a chance to share anything he'd like to share. But for now, we'll continue with the Long Prairie, Minnesota. So this happened about 4 miles east of Long Prairie, headed towards Little Falls. So, and the distance from Long Prairie to Little Falls is about 24 miles. So it happened right on Highway 27 there. And in the story, he mentions that he comes around an S turn in the road. And if you look at Highway 27, there really is no S turn along here at this distance. But when you zoom in, right in this area, right around Cauldrum, there is a short little S turn. And other than that, it's a pretty straight road. So even though we're not able to actually pinpoint the exact point on the road where it happened, given the details of the case, it's pretty safe to assume that in this S turn that's right around the Cauldrum area, that's probably where it happened along that stretch of the road. So again, a 7:15 p.m. roughly, headed towards Little Falls. So he was eastbound, and he was rounding the bend in the road when he came upon a rocket blocking the road. And he claims this rocket was brighter than the sun. So obviously, this is an artist rendition of similar to what the rocket may have looked like. And it's actually, I would say, it's a pretty good rendition of it. And the reason why I say that, because the New Fork case does have Jerry's rendering of what the rocket looked like. So you'll see and I'll show you a picture of that. It'll show you what his actual drawing was. So you'll kind of see how this is very similar to what he saw sitting in the road. He rounded the bend, saw it in the road. It was completely blocking the road, brighter than the sun. So he had to stop. And his first thought was, well, I got to get to work. And his first thought was, and this sounds crazy, but remember, he's 19 years old. His thought was, I'm going to hit this with my car and knock it off the road, which sounds crazy, but he was going to hit it with his car to knock it off the road so he could get to the radio station. And if you recall, you've probably seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And one thing that happened in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, when extraterrestrial craft got near the vehicles, the lights would shut off, the engine would shut off, the radio would shut off, and there just was no electrical activity in the vehicle at all. That's what happened when he approached this rocket, too. He was going to try to ram it, and his car just stopped, and it slowly ground to a halt. He got out, and again, I'm assuming it's because he was 19 years old, but he had this crazy thought that he wanted proof, and to get proof, he was going to tip it over and push it into the ditch, which I guess I don't know where that thought would come from, but he was going to knock it off the road and push it in the ditch. And as he was approaching the rocket, around from the sides of the rockets, he was approached by 3 entities. Now, this is an artist's rendition of what the entities look like. They were he thinks they're approximately 6 inches tall. He said they resembled tin cans, and he said they walked out on 2 little legs, and when they stopped, a third leg or projection came down, so they're like on a tripod. He said there was no face, there was no eyes, no mouth, no ears, but he was confronted by these 3 creatures, and he got the distinct impression, and they didn't have any eyes, but he still got the distinct impression that they were looking at him. So there was kind of the standoff and the stare down between him and these tin can aliens. And I don't know if we have an accurate recording of how long he was. To him, it felt like forever that he was staring at these tin can aliens. But after a little stare down for a little while, they went back to the craft and got into the craft, and the craft lifted up and took off. And if you look at the rocket back here on this page, and even here on this page, you get the impression that, how we think of our rockets from NASA as solid fuels, where it's got the big flaming thrust from the bottom that's pushing it up. That's not what he describes. He did describe a bright light from the bottom, like you can see the light from the bottom here, but he didn't describe that explosive solid fuel or liquid fuel rocket like we think of. But it lit up, and that's how it lifted off. And here's a sketch from the New Fork database, and here's that I think you are doing the people of the U.S. a grave crime not to let them know that there are things of this nature. So he really felt very strongly about this. So you can see his drawing there on the left of how he's got the rocket, the cylindrical shape, and the 3 fins coming down. And then his rendition of the aliens on the right with the 3 little legs and little arms sticking out. Our artist rendition is more interesting to look at, but that's an actual diagram of what he drew for his case on that. So I saw that in the road, and that's what his rendition of the tin can aliens looked like. He came back to the spot with the sheriff, and all they could find on there was 3 strips of an oily substance about a yard long and about 4 inches apart. Now, I don't know if they have any way of determining where the 3 oily strips actually from that craft, or was it from something else and was just a coincidence. I don't really know that, but they were able to determine they found 3 oily strips there about 4 inches apart. Interesting thing is there were several hunters in the Long Prairie area that claimed to have seen a light above them that lit up the ground that night, and there were other hunters reported seeing a light object circle around them and circle around their farm. And even a sheriff from a neighboring county corroborated the claims of a silver rocket flying through the skies of Minnesota that night. So it's not just a 19-year-old radio DJ, submitting a hoax report, making a joke, just trying to fool everybody. If it was, it's a good story, but somehow, the sheriff and the other hunters and farmers saw this too. So there's a lot of interesting stuff. So again, it's a very atypical case, but because it's atypical, to me, that kind of lends to the credibility of it, because if you're going to make something up, you want to make up something that's believable. So why don't you make up something that's like already out in people's consciousness that they go, okay, yeah, I've heard that before. That sounds realistic to me, as opposed to something that's very different and very out there that might be easier to dismiss. So one of the more interesting cases that I think from Minnesota, and this was reported in both the St. Paul Pioneer Press and the Minneapolis Star on October 25th, 1965. So you can go to the archives of both Pioneer Press and Minneapolis Star. You can go and look up the articles that they reported on this too. So yeah, so there's a lot of, it's not a very well-known case, but like I said, it's in both of those papers, and I think it's an interesting case, and it's one of my personal favorites. So that is all I've got for that one. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to do a quick check and see if we've got any questions that came in while I was doing that. So oh, Kathy Blixford says cemetery is in Redwood Falls. That's her comment on the cemetery one. So don't see any questions on this, but we do have Dean DeHarport with us. And Dean DeHarport is on Minnesota Mufon's board of directors. And he just stepped down as a field investigator, but he's been with Mufon for well over 20 years. He's been very active and has brought a lot to the chapter. So I want to give Dean an opportunity to introduce himself and anything off the top of his head that he'd like to share. Dean, take it away, if you will. Oh, you're still muted. And you're still muted. You're still muted, Dean.
Oh, well, now.
I hear you now.
Okay, all right. Yeah, as Tom said, I've been with MUFON for about 25 years. I've investigated about 70 cases, and I've found that about 20% of those cases to be unknown objects that people have seen. These people, I've never come across a person that is looking for publicity. I've always considered the people, this is quite remarkable, all the witnesses that I've interviewed, none of them seem to be trying to put me on or trying to lie to me or anything like that. And they didn't have any spectacular cases. I can't bring up a case that like Tom just talked about here that is way out of the ordinary and quite impressive. But what I can say is that the UFO phenomena is real based on just interviewing all these people all this time and not coming across people that were in any way mentally disturbed or inadequate or looking for attention. And they all seem to be fairly intelligent. My background is in meteorology, so I've been able to be a bit more critical about some of these sightings than other people might have been. And again, I found no contradictions, self-contradictions in the reports.
Yeah, and to kind of add to what Dean was saying too, or people are actually afraid of being thought of as crazy, so they tend to be a little more reluctant to bring the stories to us. So, and when the stories do come to us, we do, in general, we find them to be more credible, more reliable, more sincere and authentic, and really trying to just share their experience and trying to gain two things: kind of gain understanding into what happened to them, and also gain a little bit of validation from the people that hear it that they're not crazy. So yeah, so. Thank you for that, Dean.
Okay, if I could give one more case that I have ready to go.
Go for it.
Okay. We call this the Midway case. And this happened in 1988, July 5th of 1988. It involved a family of 5, which included 2.5-year-old Carl. It's not his real name. I'm giving substitute names for all of these people because we keep the names of witnesses confidential unless they give us written permission to do otherwise. Anyway, I received a phone call from a Mufon member named Lynn, and she said that she had talked on the phone with a woman who is a friend of hers. I'll call her Mary, who reported some strange happenings one night. Once again, this is July 5th, 1988. Mary told Lynn that her husband was away that night, and she had been awakened in her upstairs bedroom at about 11:45 p.m. by the sound of what she assumed to be 2 pairs of children's feet running around downstairs. She recognized one pair of footsteps as being those of her son Carl, and assumed the other was her 6-year-old daughter Cheryl. She believed she shouted, "Get back up here to bed," but immediately zonked out until 2:15 a.m. when she woke up to the sound of someone plunking on a ukulele. She went across the hall to Carl and Cheryl's bedroom and found Carl sitting up in his bunk bed with a strange blank look on his face, plunking on the ukulele. Now, this ukulele belonged to Carl's older brother, Harry, and it was usually kept on a high shelf in the kitchen, so Carl couldn't get it. But anyway, they found out some interesting things about this, how Carl got this ukulele a little bit later. Lynn had been reading a book by Whitley Strieber titled Communion, in which Strieber claimed he had been abducted by strange beings, which many people concluded were extraterrestrials, although Strieber himself did not make that claim. Regarding these strange happenings, Lynn told Mary, "This sounds like one of those abduction cases." So Lynn got Mary's agreement to let me investigate the case. So I went to the family's home on a Saturday morning in July 1988. They lived in the western part of St. Paul, not far from the Mississippi River and not far from the Midway Hospital. I brought along my small portable tape recorder and interviewed the family in their living room and learned many more details of the story. After Mary found Carl blinking on the ukulele, she went downstairs and found the kitchen and living room lights on, the back door unlocked and open, and the screen door unlocked. An old kitchen knife, which they had shoved into a slot in the door frame to serve as a deadbolt, was missing. She also found a chair pushed in front of the refrigerator with a step stool on top of the chair. This is where the ukulele was kept up above on a shelf up above the refrigerator. Mary was perplexed and alarmed. She shut the back door. She went back upstairs and took Carl to bed with her. She was lying there sleepless, worrying and wondering what had happened when they heard a loud bang outside overhead, which she compared to a Magnum firecracker. Carl immediately said, "He's back." His mother asked him, "Who's back?" "You know, him." "You mean Daddy?" "No, him, Bug Eye." Now, Carl had been talking about someone named Bug Eye for the past couple of months, but Mary had assumed this was just an imaginary playmate, which many young children have. And Carl was about 3 years old. Eventually, they got to sleep. The next morning, Carl complained about his bottom and his ears. Also, Mary found a thin omega-shaped scratch on his back. And so she took him to a pediatrician. The doctor found the insides of Carl's ears were red, but he believed they were not infected. However, he prescribed antibiotics just in case. He found no other problems. But it's of interest that both Carl and Mary had bloody noses in the preceding days. This is of interest because there have been reports in the literature of alien implants being inserted through nostrils. Later that day, Mary called her friend Lynn and told her about what happened. Lynn said, "This sounds like one of those abduction cases." Lynn came over and laid a copy of Whitley Strieber's Communion on the coffee table. The desk cover for this book has a painting on the front cover of an alleged alien with big black eyes. Some have compared these eyes to those of an insect. Carl saw it and said, "My friend." Then he ran outside looking for his friend all over the backyard, stopping in certain places and looking up towards the sky. They then began to question Carl, and he told them that his friend had come into his room and they had gone out to the backyard. He showed Lynn a place in the backyard where he said his friend had taken him. While he was standing in this spot, he got a strange expression on his face and clasped his hands and twisted them into an odd shape and kind of swayed around. He said his friend told him, "The moon loves you, the stars love you, and the sky loves you." He said of his friends, he loves me. He also said his friend had gotten the ukulele down for him. So after Mary and Lynn had recounted the above, we went into the kitchen where I wanted to learn if there was any way that Carl could have gotten the ukulele down by himself. We pushed a chair in front of the refrigerator, just as Mary had found it that night, and put the step stool on top of it. And we could see that even if Carl stood up on the chair, he would have been 2 feet short of the ukulele. So we had him climb up. We asked him to climb up and get the ukulele, and he said, "I'm afraid I might fall." And his older brother Harry told him, "I'll help you. You won't fall." So he helped Carl climb up on the step stool on top of the chair, and Carl reached up for the ukulele, but it's still a good foot short of touching it. The refrigerator top was covered with various things, and Carl could not have climbed on top of it. There wasn't any room for him there anyway because the shelf stuck out. So I was morally certain after this investigation that Carl had not gotten the ukulele by himself, and no one in the family would have helped him. That leaves a strong suspicion that someone or something outside the family did. There was much other information about the family and their experiences came out during the interview. Mary had had previous experiences suggesting of unknown visitors. Mary also told us that her mother and grandmother were psychic. That is, they had dreams which accurately forecasted future events. And I should mention that psychic abilities seem to follow alleged visits by extraterrestrials in a number of cases. A few weeks later, Mary was driving down the street when Carl saw a store window dummy with those wraparound sunglasses. And he shouted, "My friend," and his mother was afraid he was going to jump out of the car. He was so glad to see what he thought was his friend. Carl continued to talk about his friend for weeks after the event. So it's my conclusion that the facts in this case provide substantial evidence that an unidentified intelligent being visited a 2.5-year-old child and formed a friendly relationship with him for purposes unknown. So that's the Midway case.
Yeah, and I really like that case too. It's one of my favorites. And one of the things that I would comment on it is it's interesting because for Mufon, a lot of times what we do and how we do things, it how do I say this? It follows the phenomenon. The phenomenon kind of sets and how it determines how we evolve. And what I mean by that is, you think of UFO reports and UFO sightings, and someone sees a UFO and they report it to us. It's kind of how it logically works. But with this case, it's very different because, as best we can tell, we don't really have anyone that saw an extraterrestrial craft. There was no craft sighted. And as far as seeing an entity, the only entity that was seen by a 2.5-year-old who couldn't, actually report it to us directly. So we've got adults who are reporting kind of the effects of the phenomenon. So they can't say, we saw this entity, we saw this craft. It's very kind of detached, and the only actual witness was 2.5 years old at the time. So as things go, and another to that end, most people have heard of the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And well, as the phenomenon evolved, we had to add a fourth kind and add a fifth kind to capture as the phenomenon changed, as what happened. We had to evolve and keep up with it. So it kind of determined our evolution, and it was always ahead of us. We're always kind of tracking behind the evolution of the phenomenon, if that makes sense. And I'm getting a note saying we have 5 to 10 minutes remaining. So if you've got burning questions, so I see we got 12 people watching us. Thank you, 12 people, for watching us. We appreciate you. We got 5 to 10 minutes left. If you have questions for us, we are happy to take them. Put them in the chat box, and I'll convey them to my other 3 desperados here. We'll do the best we can to answer your questions. So let me have them, and we will answer them for you.
I'd like to add to what Tom said. And you could say that because they've seen something similar, that makes it more legit. But on the flip side, they may be saying they saw what somebody else saw. Bud Hopkins did an experiment years ago, and he would show young children probably about 20 or 30 pictures, and one of the pictures was an alien, and all the other pictures were, to me, would be a lot scarier to a kid that age than an alien. And the kids would start crying, and when they saw the alien pictures, say that's what they saw. When they saw the other pictures, they would not respond to it at all. And also, when I did my talk a couple years ago, I talked about the different types of aliens, and there are different versions, and a lot of them have very specific facial characteristics about them, and a lot of people report seeing some of the characteristics that they may not have heard of themselves. So, do we have any questions coming in?
Yeah, we do have a question coming in. I'm prepping to answer because Pat Taylor has asked a very good question, and I just happen to have some good answers for her. So Pat Taylor is asking, actually, hang on, Pat, I'm going to get to your question in just a second and get prepped to show you some real good stats on that. So Pat is asking, and Kathy says, how many Mufon handle experiencers? But I want to get to Pat's question. Pat says, how does Minnesota compare to other states for frequency of UFO reports, which I think is a great question. And so I did a report on this for Mufon yesterday. So I've got some current data capturing about 2 months worth of data that shows how Minnesota ranks against other states. And actually, I'll show it to you, and then we'll talk about what that looks like or why it looks like it does. So I'm going to share this with you. What do I share? This is what I want to share. So right here, you'll see, so this captures data from January 9th of 2021 through this past Friday. So this compares the number of reports we've seen, and this is pretty typical. California is usually the highest, with Florida and Texas coming in pretty high. If you scroll down during this time range, we had, I believe, 13. So we're down toward the, wait, where are we on that one? I thought we're ranked in here somewhere. Rankings by state, so I'm in the correct spot. Oh, that's not right. Maybe this is in the way.
There's the way down, Tom.
Oh, yeah. So we have 13. So we're down there. And that's pretty typical. And actually, so 13, that's about a 2-month period of time. And typical for Minnesota, I would say between 6 to 8, 6 to 10. And I'm sure you can understand from like December through February or March, our numbers go way down. And the reason why, that not because the UFO activity has necessarily gone down, is there's not as many people outside looking up. Most people are inside trying to stay warm. So, but this is, I would say, pretty typical. California, obviously, it's a bigger landmass. It covers a lot more area, and the population is much higher. So there's more people out, more people looking up to the sky. Kind of the same with Florida and Texas. Better weather in Florida, people outside. Texas has more people, greater space. It's a larger landmass. So this is pretty typical, though. We rank right about there, 13 in the past 2 months, and normally per month we get about 6 to 8, 6 to 10. So this is pretty normal. So thank you for that question. Actually asking me a question that's playing that I'm actually prepared to answer. I love that. So that works out great. See if we got any more questions. Oh, I'll go back to Kathy's question. Thank you for that, Pat. I hope that answered your question enough. So Kathy asks, say more how Mufon handle experiences. Okay, that's so I don't know if Bill wants to talk about that, or Dean, how does Mufon handle experiencers?
I can talk about it.
Sure.
MUFON has what is called the Experiencer Resource Team. And I'm a member of the ERT, the Experiencer Resource Team. And when someone has had an experience of a close encounter with a UFO or alleged aliens, they can fill out a questionnaire online on the MUFON website. That's mufon.com, and it has about 30 questions attempting to put some statistics on what this person has experienced. And then we set up an interview with these persons. Right now, it's generally by phone because of the COVID restrictions. And we can talk to the person. A lot of people who have experienced things like this don't feel they can talk about it with a lot of people, even close friends and family. They're concerned in many cases. And we are someone they can talk about it, and learn that hundreds, thousands of people have had these experiences. And it can be reassuring to know that they aren't alone in having these experiences. So that pretty much in a nutshell, what one of the things that we do regarding experiencers.
Could I make one more comment?
Please, by all means.
Yeah, I want to share with everybody there at MarsCon information, actually a video on UFOs that will convince you that UFOs are real, or else nothing will. It's a 50-minute video, and it has senators, military commanders, scientists, astronauts, pilots, psychologists. We got Senator Rubio, Senator Reid, military commanders in England, scientist Michio Kaku, J. Allen Hynek, who started out as a advisor to a Project Blue Book study of UFOs that ran from 1950 something to 1968 or something, and he started out as being employed to debunk any reports of UFOs, and later became a UFO convert and wrote a book about it. You have astronauts, including Gordon Cooper, and most importantly, you see the pilots that have had experiences with these UFOs, that have been chased by them, and have seen them up close and seen them react to the movements of their own airplanes. And they even have information that Russian and Chinese planes have been lost to UFO combat. It's a very powerful video, and the name of it again is, it's on YouTube. A story this big can't be kept secret.
I'm going to just type that name in there, so in the text, so you get a story this big.
Can't be kept secret. It's the most powerful video on UFOs I've ever seen.
And do you have the link, Dean? Do you if you send the link in our text, I can put it in the chat text.
Link is just go to YouTube and type in that title.
Okay, so I just put the title in the chat so people can see that. A story this big can't be kept secret. So cool. So
okay,
I'm going to look and see if we get any more questions coming in, or if any of the other three panelists have more they want to share. Bill, yes, please.
I'm going to have to leave now. I have a previous engagement.
Sure.
So goodbye, good luck, and stay away from the dark forces.
That's a good advice. Thank you, Bill. Thank you for this and for all you do for Minnesota MUFON. Okay, so let me take a look and see. I'm not seeing any more questions coming in. Dean or Mike, do you have any closing thoughts before I do our official close and wrap for this?
Not me.
Go ahead, Dean.
No, I don't have anything. No.
Mike?
I just want to thank everybody for joining. And does anybody have any questions right now about the meetings or anything about us in general?
I'm not seeing any questions coming in.
Okay.
Anybody can join Mufon and come to our meetings.
Yep. Okay, so time for the official close. Thank you everyone for attending the panel and MarsCon. We hope you enjoyed the weekend. You can find all the weekend's content on the MarsCon YouTube channels and on our website, marscon.org. There's still time to check out the GPS charity auction, which closes at midnight tonight, and there's always time to buy Girl Scout cookies. So hope you enjoyed our video presentation. Hope you enjoyed the Q&A and our stories. Thank you all for attending MarsCon and surviving the forces of darkness. We want to see you next year where our future isn't that, what is it called? Oh, no, I forget. Our future, the past isn't what our future used to be or something like that. Hopefully we'll see you next year. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye. Take care. I'm Tom from Minnesota Mufon, joined by Michael Harris and Dean DeHartport. Take care. Have a fantastic MarsCon, and hopefully we'll see you at a Mufon meeting. See ya.